My name is Edward Zwick, and I'm the director of the film Defiance. The film began 13 years ago in our minds when we read an obituary in the New York Times about a man named Zuсь Bельский. And what we read was so extraordinary because though each of us had believed to know a great deal about what happened during World War II, none of us had known this story. And the more we learned, the more remarkable it became. So to begin the movie, we decided to have footage of the real story, archival footage of mass graves, of executions, of the depredations of the Germans. We wanted to create a context in which a young viewer, perhaps less knowledgeable of the circumstances, would at least be able to place himself in the story, because the story begins very much in process. This village that you see here on screen is actually part of a museum in Lithuania, a living museum, because the Russians, when they took over Lithuania and controlled it for probably 50 years, created these historical sites almost in a kind of perverse celebration of what no longer existed. And so when we went back to begin the film, we were able to go back and find places that were exactly as they might have been when the story is told in 1941. We shot in Lithuania. Lithuania is only about 100 kilometers from Belarus. Its topography is identical. We couldn't go into Belarus to shoot because it's one of the last remaining dictatorships in Europe, and entrance and exit is very difficult, and there's a great absence of infrastructure there. This massacre that you see is standing in for so many that took place at that moment. It wasn't just that 50,000 were killed. Ultimately, hundreds of thousands were taken and sent to various camps or even buried in mass graves. The Bельskis lost not only their parents but also two of their brothers. And they found that it had all happened almost overnight. Operation Barbarossa was the brutal and the beginning of the depredations of the war. The plan to execute Jews was first to kill them on sight, and indeed 300,000 were killed very, very quickly, not sent away to camps, but buried in mass graves. And among them were the family of these brothers. Now, these were brothers not like the city Jews. They were unsophisticated, they were uneducated, they were rough. Someone who knew them once described them as blocks of wood. And they were utterly unprepared and the least expected leaders that one could ever imagine. But they were accustomed to living rough. Their father owned a mill, they were woodsmen, and they had spent their childhood playing in the deep forests of Belarus. And so they did what anyone would do when given a chance. They fled only to preserve themselves. And so they went to the woods. The woods are extraordinary. The way we found these woods was on Google Earth. We looked at a map that showed the abundance and proximity of woods surrounding the city of Vilnius in Lithuania. And you'll see these beautiful birches, which are very, very evocative of the Eastern European landscape.
Stop! Stop! You want to cry? Stop! Stop!
The first thing we all had to decide, as the cast and I, is what the film should sound like. We had to hit on a particular sound. The idea is not Russian, and neither is it the Yiddish accent, because the Yiddish accent is in fact people speaking a language not their own when they came to America. What we finally hit on was a sound that was a particular kind of Eastern Polish sound, and we all worked with dialect coaches to try to achieve that sound. It was a conceit of the movie that English would stand in for Yiddish, but that meant also then that there had to be other languages. And you'll see as we get later in the film how Daniel and Liev particularly had to learn a great deal of Russian. The idea being that these people were other than the lingua franca, And so to establish that feeling of otherness, we want them to speak a language that was their own as well as someone else's language. Now, the creation of brothers was a very interesting thing for actors because it's one thing to talk about, but quite another to actually feel as if it's real. The real joy of working with actors like Liev and Daniel and Jamie is how much they understand what they can intuitively bring to a story and what is unspoken. And so, even as we began to know each other and work together, they developed a kind of competitive, jocular, very particular relationship with each other. I felt that Daniel took Jamie under wing in a great way, and Daniel and Liev, two extraordinary actors in their own right, Liev really being, at this moment, probably the most celebrated theater actor in America, and Daniel, a theater actor himself, having suddenly had this remarkable thing happen to his life as James Bond, were these two men of the same age, really at the height of their powers. And the competition that the story describes was also enhanced by the way that they would sort of vie with each other only in the best of spirit, physically, with humor, but always in the service of this relationship. And there are little things throughout that you'll see how it tends to inform the relationship and lead us to believe that they really are brothers.
I told him to stay here.
Now, the first thing you'll see are several forests, and the challenge of making this movie was often the challenge of understanding the passage of time and geography. So the first forest we found is a beautiful, deciduous forest, and we began shooting in late August, early September. So things are very green. And, of course, as the story begins, as it did at the time, it was that season of the year. Now, this is a quite remarkable thing that happens here because we went scouting through various forests to try to decide what place one might decide to shoot this mass grave that Aaron finds. And as we got there, and as we began shooting, I noticed a concrete plinth very nearby, and I asked one of the PAs what it meant, and he didn't know, and he asked someone, and he didn't know. But eventually we found someone who said, oh yes, this is a place where thousands were buried. And in fact, we had chosen a place near where there had been an actual massacre and an actual mass grave dug. And it's a very strong feeling to realize that you are summoning up ghosts, that the story you're telling has its reality, and that it's one thing to begin to tell a story, but quite another to realize that it really happened. And I felt its effect on all of the actors to be aware that they were honoring something true, that they were trying to really participate in the preservation of something, the witness of something for those who didn't know it and would now know it for all time.
We need rifles, machine guns.
Machine guns? What next? You're going to take on the whole German army.
Just because.
So here begins the process whereby the brothers, almost against their will, are confronted with responsibilities beyond their own. There were, in fact, people wandering throughout the forests of Eastern Europe. There are many, many books. There's a wonderful author named Aaron Appelfeld who talked about his time alone. What one discovers is that hundreds of Jews, even thousands, left. Many joined the Russian partisans. Some were accepted into partisan bands. Some were killed. Some were killed by local villagers. Others were taken in. Some lived on their own. The notion that all went quietly and willingly to the camps is one of those historical canards that's convenient to try to give a monolithic understanding of a culture, but in fact not at all true. It turns out that the spirit of resistance, the impulse at least, was everywhere. It was usually thwarted. It was futile. They were a stateless people. They confronted a horrible programmatic genocide. And yet their story here was not the only one. It just happens to be the most successful and most remarkable one. Now here we have one of the many, many supporting players in this movie who do remarkable work in only one scene. Jano Shira is just a great, great actor, and you'll notice throughout the film, even his wife there, is these are great either Russian, Polish, or Lithuanian actors, many of whom are the stars of their national theater, who are willing to come and do 1, 2 days, even a week with us. Here's a wonderful detail, for instance. You spend time in a country in Eastern Europe and you learn the traditions. The idea that you throw out a bit of the vodka in commemoration of those who are gone is something that just finds its way as a detail into the scene, as does Daniel sort of chowing down on those pickles, which is just the way that they do it, and we all did a bit of vodka in our time there. Now this shot coming up actually looks like a very simple shot. It was actually one of the most difficult shots of the movies because you begin outside and suddenly you come in and crane up into a very dark, very half-lit set. And we had to build a special rig because you have a night exterior that you pull back in, you have to change your stop, follow Daniel as the crane rises and up into this setting up there in the loft. This actor here, too, is just a terrific comic actor. Actually does everything at the Lithuanian National Theater. And like many Lithuanians, he speaks Russian. So Daniel and Liev, in their Russian, were surrounded by people who would actually work with them, and they got to know the sounds as well as working only with a dialect coach. I think hearing the Russian, to me, helps in a way that I've learned actually in some other circumstances. I think when we did Traffic, the amount of Spanish that one heard and saw subtitled, and in Blood Diamond, the number of dialects that one used, even the Japanese in Samurai, I think it just adds a good sense of verisimilitude to the storytelling.
Идите и посмотрите. А заодно и навоз мне разгребите.
Чтоб ушки на макушке!
It was important for us that these were policemen, that their uniforms were of the local police and not the predictable Nazi SS, because indeed it was the local police who were just as complicit in what happened. And here we begin to meet some more of the supporting cast. That's Alan Corduner there, who you see, one of the first people actually in my mind once we began to write the character Shimon.
I'm sorry, but they have to go with you.
Alan is an amazing stage actor and also someone who did a great job in a movie called Topsy Turvy, where he played Arthur Sullivan opposite Jim Broadbent. And it turned out that Alan's family, many of them had actually been in this part of Eastern Europe and been lost, and he was extremely keen to be part of this. What's wonderful about his performance is how easy it would have been to sentimentalize the work. And in fact, what he gives instead is a deeply, deeply sort of tough and unsentimental performance as this former teacher.
Come on.
Thank you.
Now you'll see now in this next shot where we establish the river, and the river becomes a very nice geographical point, which later becomes important when they have to cross it when they're fleeing. It's just one of the ways you begin to establish geography in the forest. And here they're on a path, which you'll notice now is all green. Soon after this in the movie, we went away from this location for a while so that fall could begin to set in. And by the time we came back there, the color had begun to evolve in the forest, and that gave us a great sense of the passing of time as one of the first real movements of time in the piece.
A wise choice.
A wise choice. What a stupid schoolboy.
My whole life I presumed to teach others the right way to live. I had no doubt this is God's way.
You'll notice the costuming here, how, Daniel and his brothers are of a much rougher look. Now, what you see beginning now is this urban look. And Jenny Bevan's work, as these people's look begins to change, as they hold on to bits of their urbanity and yet begin to combine it with more functional clothing. Here, the idea of how little they had to eat, how they had to share, I think in every scene it was important to me to show them doing something, building something, digging something, eating something, cutting something. So much of their lives were caught up with tasks. And I think it, to my mind, it takes a bit of the curse off of the more presentational aspects of a story like this, that they're just constantly working in order to survive. And here begins the process of attrition. Already that little girl who brought in is now dead, and her father's digging her grave. And throughout the movie, you'll see, more and more die, as indeed they did. It just is a kind of a drumbeat. This weapon is a great old World War I Russian pistol that somebody would have had lying around. And the armorers were very proud to have found one that was functional in England, and they brought it from there. God knows how it got there. Now here we're back at that living museum where we found a different hut alone. This scene is something that was, very crucial to us in the telling of the story. The idea that his impulse toward vengeance would be exactly the same as his brother's. And it does sort of set the terms of the movie, that it says it's going to be in some way unsparing. And of course you begin to hear Daniel speak Russian, and that sort of comes as a bit of a surprise. But then, of course, as it's just accepted and it makes sense, it all sort of starts to dawn on you that these people speak a different language than the authorities. Very difficult to shoot the scene because it's a real room. And whenever you're shooting in a small space, we really didn't have a lot of money in this film, and we couldn't build much at all. So we had to find these spaces. We had to find a way, actually. Dan Wilde, the production designer, who's a genius in his own right, had to figure out a way in these historical sites that we could shoot. And you'll notice all of a sudden there's a time coming up very soon where there's blood on the walls. Well, you can't splash blood all over the walls of national historical sites. So he had to find a way that he could put a gloss over the walls, which is a matte gloss, where that blood that then gets shot up there could then be washed off. You'll see it there behind them all. Now this actress, again, she was playing Lady Macbeth in the National Theatre. She's one of the great actresses of Lithuania. And her performance, even though it's on screen for 30 seconds, suddenly adds this whole level of complexity to the piece, where her grief is equal to the grief of those who have been persecuted. They drank a lot. That's probably Slivovitz or something. That was probably a bottle of the period. Now, subtly, you'll notice the camp beginning to change. There are lean-tos there now. It's been a few days. They're woodsmen. They've built these little shelters for themselves. And the progress of the growth of the camp is very important, and it's all sort of charted throughout the piece as they spend more time there, thinking of what they would have done with their time. I very much like the quality of humor that begins to enter into the scene, almost inappropriately here, as they talk about the teacher, and you realize that they were bad boys. They're not necessarily reverent about what they did, and the character of Zusia's interest in what that violence felt like is key to the dialectic between them, that he's someone for whom vengeance and the expression of violence becomes liberating, whereas the character of Tuvья, now having tasted it, begins to find it distasteful. But they make a very, very calculated decision that they're not going to do what, of course, they begin to do, that more come. This is a very crucial moment in the movie here. It's not just because more people come, and some of them are very important, as Jody May here, and Janjo and Mark Feuerstein are introduced. But the moment following this, after they're having a bit of a confrontation about what we're going to do, it's when the character that Liev plays sees the girl walk by here. And suddenly you realize that sex and attraction and even humor is going to be part of this movie. That life is going to go on, even in the midst of this horrible circumstance. Now here, of course, they're building again, and you watch the camp beginning to develop. The whole camp was built by local carpenters in the manner that they would have done it at the time. You know, of course, sometimes they used power tools to do it, hammers and saws, but it's very primitive, and the whole intent was to do it in the same style so as to not be able to do more than these people would have been able to do in the time that we've allotted them. And this is Mark Feuerstein being introduced. Mark is an actor that I've worked with before, and the spirit that he brings was very important because he's not just the intellectual, he's the reasonable man. He's actually closest perhaps to those of us making the film who were constantly asking ourselves, well, where would we fit into this story? How would we have done? And his journey becomes, in some way, our journey.
Hello, boys. What can we do for you?
Now, this is great. This is a Lithuanian actor and an English actor together playing these brothers coming in.
These little shits are holding us up. You have the balls to shoot me, little shit.
We have food. We have food.
No.
We'll share.
No, I want to see if this little shit has the balls to shoot me. You like to shoot Jews, little shit?
Well, we're approaching one of the watershed moments in which Zusia's character first discovers that his wife has been killed.
Hey, look at me. Where you from?
It becomes his formative moment in which the vengeance becomes foremost in his mind. And this is a moment that Liev and I talked about a great deal because, there are any number of ways to play this. And we arrived at this notion of him banging his head against the tree. And that's one thing to say that, but quite another to figure out how to do that. We then had to build a tree with rubber in it for him to hit his head against it. A tree with, it's just wonderful just to watch as this happens in his eyes, just that very, very subtle dawning without words. And not just rubber in a tree, but a tree that one could load with blood, so that in one take, without a cut, without CG, this person would seem to be really doing what he's doing there. And you'll see, as he begins to hit his head and the blood appears, it happens just before your eyes, and so you really believe it to be real. And as sometimes happens in movies, something kind of remarkable happens. You'll see the blood begin to drip down his forehead, and it traces this path. And as his tears drop down his face, so too does the blood begin to travel. And it's not that it's a scene about blood, but somehow the reality of how that happens somehow corroborates the depth of the emotion, and it just makes it all feel as if, this must really have happened, because how could one ever have, planned such a thing? But their physicality is very important, the way that Daniel embraces him and holds him. They're very physical with each other through the movie. You imagine them wrestling, fighting, being that way as brothers. And I think it informs their relationship as well.
And also in the Lepkanska. Then we are the Belskie Otrяд.
And now you have Jamie's beginning of an involvement with the group. He says we're the Otrяд. He's, outside of the process. He's the youngest. He's often, as you'll see in this scene, in the middle of their dynamic. And often the scenes become a kind of vying for his loyalty.
This will not bring your family back.
Blood for blood.
Now, Züś wants revenge, and Tuvьya is trying to be reasonable.
Vengeance is mine. Who said that to you?
Oh, what? This
Also in the screenplay, Clay and I very much wanted to have this biblical leitmotif. So by evoking words like vengeance is mine and who said that, the idea of the two brothers, Moses and Aaron, of the story of the Exodus, of these sort of ill-prepared people having to take on this responsibility for their people, it's hinted and then finds its expression more and more times until you finally reach the end of the movie as they're going through the swamp and almost parting the sea, that you realize that it is indeed this biblical metaphor that's been sustained. Another Lithuanian actor here. This is another museum, a little town that they've created to try to evoke what the past was. Now this truck, of course, we couldn't burn a truck. That's all just fake fire bars and flame bars. This was a very difficult scene to shoot because not only were we shooting at night, but suddenly the temperature dropped and suddenly we're doing stunts and we're in this very wet, watery thing in terrible, terrible, wet, freezing weather, and it was extremely difficult. It was actually 3 nights that we were out there doing all of this. That's a real, that's a pick on the end of a stuntman, that he hits a spot and it's pulled off. The wire is actually not even touching him, but the sleight of hand makes it look as if he's been knocked off himself. Now, in terms of Eduardo Serra, and I haven't yet spoken about the cinematography, he is not only one of the most gifted cinematographers in the world, but also someone so committed to a feeling of reality. And so a night exterior is one of the most challenging things for a DP to really do, because really, how do you express the darkness? And only by using light. And the use of the lights of the car and not overemphasizing that sort of fake moonlight and allowing there to be huge dark spaces in the screen is a very bold way to approach this. So he uses things like the headlights. He uses the lights of the machine guns when they fire, the oncoming searchlight, and all of this then suddenly becomes the interactive elements that light the scene and give it its excitement. This stunt sequence, we wanted to be raw. We didn't want it to be pretty. We didn't want it to be stunty. People get shot. They miss each other. They shoot this guy here and only shoot him in the leg. He gets up and runs again. The character that of Züś now, he's not really good at a machine gun. You'll notice him sort of firing wildly. Later in the piece, he's become more adroit because he's actually been working on it. And of course, all the actors worked with weapons. These are Schmeisser submachine guns. These are old, very finicky weapons.
To the Belskie Otrяд.
Cigarettes.
Each time you do an action sequence, the challenge is how not to do, something that someone has done before better or in somehow the same way. Our decision was to really try to go, if you will, very analog, that it wasn't about huge explosions, it wasn't about extraordinary amounts of bullet hits and things exploding, but rather the idea of people running, people missing, the idea that it was hard to hit someone, that it was scary when they did. This is beautiful work by Eduardo here, as you see in the next shot as Jamie runs and the light is behind him there. You see, by the way, when that light turns around, that it's raining. So in the midst of this freezing night, we began to have a freezing rain for 2 nights, and it was not a pleasant experience. When Jamie runs, it's quite remarkable. He's an amazing athlete, and obviously people know how he dances, but his physicality in the movie is quite good. This image here of somebody scraping the bottom of the pot is something that Daniel and I talked about in the very beginning. The idea that the hunger could find a sound and a gesture that we would all begin to see just the price that they're paying here and what he's now done by not be able to get them more food. It was very important for Daniel and to me to really describe Tuvьya's plight as that of somebody who is confused and in some sense ill-prepared. He very much wanted the character of Züś to seem like the more dominant figure, so that his confusion would set up the arc of his character, that he's somebody who is taking charge, but only reluctantly, only because there's nothing else to do. He was very concerned, and rightly so, of the presumption, the temerity of somebody choosing to lead and take responsibility for other people's lives when indeed it's something that he'd never really imagined himself doing or even felt himself capable of doing. And so the scene that we're about to come to is that first moment when he asserts himself. It's clear that his brother has put them in harm's way, that his brother in his reactive violence is incapable of leading. And so here he's going to confront a situation where he's going to have to step forward. But we didn't want to do that in some way that was hokey, so we created this moment here in which the group starts to fall apart. And I was blessed to have an amazing ensemble of actors. People like Jody May, people like Mark Feuerstein, people like Tomas Aranya there, who's just come into the camp, some of the Lithuanian actors. And so it becomes a kind of theater piece as they're all arguing. And we worked on this as a kind of a workshop piece, and we did it first as an improvisation, and then we began to shape it more and more. And you'll see, typical of Jews, when there are 4 Jews in the room, there are 16 opinions. Here you see them all beginning to argue, and as it begins to escalate, Tuvья has no choice but to do what he does. And here in silence, in this transition, which is so well done on Daniel's part, becomes the end of the first act of the movie, in which he owns his size and takes command in his brother's face.
Afford to lose friends like Yakov and Peretz.
Or the soil.
I think Daniel's choice to play this part was very much even in reaction to having become James Bond and the star.
Do not lose anyone.
To do something as internal as this, something that is reluctant and soulful, is a statement of his ambitions, his artistic ambitions, and his range as an
So
actor.
as not to visit the same farms too often, and we would take only from those who can afford to give, and we will leave those who can't alone. Our revenge is to live.
Now that line, which is a good line in the movie Our Revenge is to Live, is a line that evolved on the set. The scene needed a hinge, and it just came to me as we stood there that that's something he might say. And after doing several takes, I came up and whispered to him, well, what about using this there? And it suddenly turned the scene, and it really allowed it to pivot and begin to climb.
We should die.
And he finds this almost buoyant, cheerful resolute attitude here, it sort of ends the scene in a very different place than where it all began. And of course, his brother has spoken now for the first time. And now you'll notice that it's fall. Suddenly, yellow leaves have found their way into the set, and we go back to a different part of the forest where it has begun to turn, and where it hasn't, we begin to paint leaves and add a few of our own and blow a few around.
Сарае.
Those geese seem to put in appearances several times in the movie. They're not credited, though. This next shot, actually coming up, feels like something out of a John Ford movie, with the overhanging branch and the makeshift grave and the figure standing there in mostly silhouette and the log cabin back there. It's one of those things that happens and you look at after the fact and say, was I quoting there or did it just happen to be there? And of course, here they now find that Asoil is still alive, but we introduce two more characters. We introduce the character of Chaya and the character of Bella. Chaya is played by this extraordinary young actress, Mia Wasikowska, whom I had first seen on tape. She is Polish, who was living in Australia. She's now since been cast by HBO in that wonderful series In Treatment, and by Tim Burton as Alice, but we'd seen none of this when we first worked with her, and she was just the most delightful surprise. And Eben is this huge star in her home country of Denmark, but had only been in America once, and that was in the movie High Fidelity with John Cusack. And she's very pretty. She's got white blonde hair and blue eyes, and we really had to knock her look down. We put a terrible mousy brown rinse on her, bad contact lenses, took away any of her natural color, and really had to knock down her beauty to play this part. The interesting thing, of course, is that both brothers lost their wives, and both of them found new love in the forest. So it wasn't a question about adding love interests, it was in fact telling the historical truth. And it's one of those instances in which historical truth, when it suits the narrative, is a very beautiful thing. It just doesn't always happen. Now, this relationship as it develops between the two characters here is very much an evocation of a very famous Yiddish short story called The Quarrel, in which two men meet in Poland, one arguing for the secular and the other arguing for the religious, are then separated by the Nazi invasion and find themselves again in the concentration camps, where they begin arguing again, only to lose each other and presume each other dead, and then find each other 10 years later on the streets of Paris, where they continue their argument.
What's the name?
Now here's a great moment, because this was Daniel's idea, to yell out like that, which is such a big brother, little brother thing to do. It was written just that they would be talking about her, but he decided just to try to embarrass Jamie like that. And of course it lends this whole other little subtextual attitude toward his love of his little brother.
Make sure he understands my orders. Go and talk to her. Go.
This is one of the rare moments of the whole movie where you see Daniel smile, actually. And now you see fall and little red tree back there, and you begin to hear Liev speak Russian. And his Russian is astonishing. Daniel's is good, but Liev's is really remarkable according to those who really know what they're listening to.
Немцам везу. Если заказ точь-в-точь не выполню, убьете меня и семью мою.
Leave half. You cannot go.
Jenny Bevan and I spent a lot of time talking about what the coat should be, because this coat becomes important. First, it's the coat that Liev takes from him. Then Daniel ends up wearing it when Liev leaves. And then Daniel gives it to Lilka when she's running. And here's the same trail you've seen before, but now you're seeing it and there's color in it.
You know who goes there, Lazar? We go there.
And almost another comic runner here with the character Lazar of the Who Goes There, kind of almost a vaudeville routine, but very much sort of in the Sholem Aleichem tradition of the fool, the fools of Chelm, where they were always doing things that were a little bit absurd, and that's sort of the character of Levine in this story.
You're getting along all right. Anything you need? An extra blanket?
No, thank you. I'm fine.
This is an actor named Sam Spruill, again, a really fine young English actor coming to do this smaller part. A lot of these actors like Sam Spruill and Jodie May and John Joe, they were willing to be members of an ensemble, which meant sitting around day after day, often doing very little, almost doing background work, for the sake of these moments where they did significant scenes. It just gave such an elevated feel to the ensemble, and so each moment was, or rather, there was never a moment that was untrue. It wasn't like you had a day player there. You had an accomplished player in every moment. Here's Thomas Aranya, who has starred in many movies. He had a big part in Gladiator, I recall, and many others.
Your wife. They say she was killed last week.
Now another watershed as Tuvья finds out that his wife, too, has been killed. And you begin to hear in the background the sound of this violin. This theme was one of the first that James Newton Howard wrote. He wrote it even while we were in Lithuania, and he sent it to me. And once we realized that it was the violin, it became a question of who should play it. And there are very few people in the world today whose work is more extraordinary than Josh Bell. And so we reached out to him as well. It was a very interesting journey for James Newton Howard, because until about, I think it must have been 5 or 6 years ago, he didn't know that he was Jewish. His father had never talked about it. His mother was not. And only when his father died did he learn from his grandfather that they were Jewish. So for him, it was a journey back into an idiom that he had always been drawn to but didn't know why. And the sound of the violin, of course, is the sound of Eastern Europe. It's the sound of a culture that is it's the sound of everything that was lost. The concept of forest wives was very important to us. It's one of those truths of life that even in the midst of the most dire of circumstances, men and women, sex, attraction, comfort, that carries on. And the idea that these people who had lost wives and husbands would reach out to each other, sometimes out of practicality, sometimes out of the need for comfort, and sometimes out of convenience. It was important for us to try to describe those relationships too. The notion of what community really is, the idea that community continues, and that the preservation of community is in fact an act of defiance, was very central to this movie. Look at Liev's fingernails. Look how dirty they are. The detail, the proliferation of detail, is something in a movie you can't really talk about, but I think intuitively you begin to understand it and begins to aggregate, to have meaning. That the clothes look broken in, that the faces are dirty, that the food is right. Now here you see the river again. The thing we've established as a place of where they are. You see the yellow leaves have come in, and now they're all leaving, but they leave and they cross the river. And that says something to you in your mind to understand, okay, they were in this one place, and now they're leaving this place. We don't know where they're going, but we're now going to look for a new place for them to go. And their process of leaving one place and going another is one of the central visual themes of the movie. The idea that they were constantly having to leave. We watch them go through all the painstaking detail, the trouble, the the rigor, the ardor of building this camp, and suddenly, at a moment's notice, they're forced to leave it and go. And this begins almost a leitmotif in the movie, and there's a little hiatus here when they fire at these guys and they drive them back. Well, there's the shot actually that became the poster of the movie, actually. I suddenly look at it now and realize that that's where we took that still from. And here again, there's firing. You see one person shot in the leg, you see someone else in the arm. They're banging off trees. They're not really, seeing great bloody deaths or great, stunts. It's much closer, at least, to what we imagined might have been like in those days, in which some people have the higher ground, other people take hiding, and they sort of run away.
Give up Belsky! And the rest of you can go free!
You're from Belarus, you pig! Why do you work with the Germans against your own people?
For the same reason you steal for the poor! To survive! Shit!
So that's the only sort of blood you see at that moment, is a shot in the arm. And somehow it feels more realistic, more plausible that that's about what you'd see. And in this yellowing wood now, you see them retreat. And this really is the moment in which the conflict between Tuvья and Züss becomes very amplified and almost out in the open.
Next time you can draw them a map.
And what does that mean?
It means we should have killed the fucking milkman. The policy of the
I like seeing the two profiles like that.
Winter is coming, and now we have no shelter. Why? Because you don't have the stomach to do what must be done.
And here begins one of their first journeys. And there are three.
Go!
They leave one camp and they go to the other. And the image of this group of people wandering from one place to the next, carrying all their possessions, is both an ancient image and a modern image. It looks back to the diaspora of the Bible, in which the Jews were forced to wander through the wilderness for 40 years, in the desert, kicked out of one place after the other throughout the centuries even. And it also anticipates an image which is the most salient image of the 20th century, which is the image of the refugee. People having to leave the violence of war, going they know not where. And whether that's now in Darfur or Bosnia or the Middle East, it suggests that this story resonates both forward and backward. It's also a very, very biblical image. Here again, they're just eating crusts and sharing pieces of meat, and that's just constantly happening through the movie, that people are always trying to eat. And even now, in the midst of their rivalry, of course, I like the moment, the idea that Züś stands up and joins his brother. And here we meet two great Russian actors. It's one thing to have to speak a foreign language in a film, as Daniel and Liev are asked to do, but quite another to then do that opposite two great actors in that other language. And that, I think, is their triumph in this movie, is that they pull that off.
Бригада братьев революций. Ищем товарищей. А что за бригада такая? Отряд Бельских. Слыхали, еврейские бандиты?
Now, the Russians were a very, very complicated group at this moment. They had been defeated and had to withdraw, but there were hundreds, even thousands, who were hiding in the woods. And they organized very quickly. And Stalin realized very soon that this could become a very important element in his fight to try to recapture Russia. And so he began to supply these partisan bands. It was very much in his thinking that these bands would not only help sabotage and be a kind of important distraction to the enemy, but also that they would prepare the ground for his political taking over of this country once he came back. The Russians themselves were very ambivalent about the Jews. There had been many Jews who had been close to Stalin in the early years, and there were many Jews who joined partisan bands. Some were treated well, some were abused. Women particularly had a very difficult time in the Russian partisan bands. And also, after the war, the Russians tended to rewrite their history as they chose, and they tended to try to discount any Jewish involvement of the partisans. And that's some of the history that has now come to light, is just how many Jews had been part of some of the Russian partisan brigades. Now, you'll notice we've now entered a pine forest, a coniferous forest. That allowed us not just to go from fall into winter, because, of course, the deciduous forest should have lost all its trees, but a coniferous forest stays green. It also becomes something that we can begin to play with a bit as they begin their camp. As we ourselves were shooting on now into November, we could build another camp. Looks very different, feels very different. It's on the hillside. But we could also begin to introduce the element of snow, which comes soon, because we knew we were going to get snowed in. So we figured this: if we could beat the snow and start to introduce it, then when it really snowed, it would all join together.
Thank you. If my friends at the New Socialist Club could see me now.
And now here they are. They're building again. They're digging. One thing to talk about now, I've not mentioned much about the cinematography yet. It was Eduardo who thought we should shoot the movie in 1.85, not 2.35, not only because we didn't have much set, but also because that allowed us to shoot with much faster lenses. We gained almost 2 stops by shooting with the fastest lenses possible, and he sometimes was pushing the film 2 stops. It was already getting very late. The days were getting very short. We were in the dark forest, and you'll notice you never see the sky in the movie. We're in these bowls. We're in very dark trees. It's this kind of penumbral light. And so as to have enough available light to shoot, it was very important for us to be able to have as much stop as possible. And it gives this consistent, almost oppressive, but also very beautiful light. The forest has always been, in literature, a place of transformation. It's the Grimm fairy tales. In Midsummer Night's Dream, the forest is the place that people go to in order to change. And change takes place to all these people here.
Welcome, Insek.
I'm from Baranovice. The ghetto is being liquidated.
Also, Daniel here introduces this cap, and you'll see little items of Russian and German captured gear begin to find themselves into the clothing. And this is Jenny Bevan's great gift, as characters who have come citified begin to transform before your eyes. Very subtly, you don't know it until you see suddenly that they've really become integrated into the group.
Thank you very much. No.
Thank you.
Welcome.
And here, finally, the process of the antipathy between Zuсь and Tuvья emerges after this moment with Asoil and with Chaya.
And what does it mean? Do what we can.
Now, the idea of doing a fight in a movie is a very dangerous convention, because you come up against every fight that has ever been done. How do you possibly do something that is different and that expresses the characters and it helps the story and doesn't suddenly seem like a set piece? The idea we finally came to was that it should be part of almost a conversation and tinged with sadness and almost a kind of violation. The idea that one brother hits the other and it happens publicly. It becomes as much about their relationship to the group as it does to each other. And this speech too, is very important. Clay and I wanted to talk about the fact that like any culture, that Jewish culture is not simple, that there are those who are, that class is important, that education is often a divisive element rather than only a good one. All right, so there's one punch thrown, and it hurts, and somebody doesn't immediately hit them back. I hate those fights when people hit each other 9 times in the face and don't fall down. It's just not what life is like.
Tuvьya.
And then they grapple, and then it's not pretty, and they're rolling around on the ground. And it's only because one person gets up and stands up, and he gets one more punch, and he is down. As one would be with that kind of a punch. And the idea that Züch dominates him here, publicly. Now here is a moment that really just came to us as we were doing this. The idea that he picks up a rock and suddenly you think of Cain and Abel. You suddenly see one brother about to smite another with a stone, and it becomes very primitive. George McKay, the young man playing Aron, is this really remarkable young man. He's very smart. He, in anticipation of doing the part, began to read all of the histories available and became as knowledgeable as so many of us who had been on the movie for a year about this particular moment in world history and Eastern Europe.
Are you coming?
So now the struggle for the soul of the youngest brother is decided. He decides to stay, and Züch goes off by himself. Liev's work on stage, to me, these past 10 years has been as thrilling as any that I've seen, whether that's in Glengarry Glen Ross, for which he won a Tony, or Talk Radio, or some of the Shakespeare in the Park. But I think this film takes some of that and shows an audience that may not have seen his power quite as it does in these moments, and it's to me one of the most successful aspects of the film. Now this, of course, is in Vilnius, and here we are in what was really the ghetto. It's been preserved, much of it turned into beautiful apartments, but it is the place where the story would have taken place if we were telling the story about Lithuania. We just happen to be telling the story about Belarus, which is just down the road a bit. And here you see the forest, now the birch forest, having turned entirely yellow.
We are not so naive to think they won't.
This scene was very important to us to try to get right, because any story that talks about Jews fighting back, it would be fatuous not to talk about the predicament of those who didn't.
Death camps.
They were in an impossible situation. The idea that if some left, that others would be killed. So the idea was how we could do that in the story and yet not make it a kind of history lesson or a sociology exercise. And the idea that it's about him trying to assert himself, and this introduces Lilka into the story, makes it part of the narrative as well as just a kind of pageant, if you will.
The old, the sick, how will we live?
We will protect you. We have made alliances with the Russian partisans.
Also, Mark is quite wonderful in the scene, and he's pissed off. He's not a kindly elder. He's in fact someone who is tired and sick of this conversation and may indeed be right.
Fine.
It was important to us that the character that Züсь Bельski plays here at this moment and throughout the piece is not necessarily always right.
Your daughter, Chaya, she's with us. Your husband.
It's funny, it's one of the few scenes that Eduardo gets to light a big, beautiful interior, and you see his extraordinary gift. I mean, he was nominated for an Oscar for Wings of a Dove, and, suddenly you see his amazing skill. It's much more subtle throughout the movie when you're looking at the forest, but when you look at some of these lit interiors, you suddenly go, oh my God, we're in the presence of a master.
I am going.
I am going.
Me too.
And now we're introducing more members of the ensemble, and Alexa Davalos enters the scene, and so do some of the other more supporting players, Chaya's parents, Oppenheim, the gunsmith. This little image here is something that occurred to me as we're shooting, but it is one of my favorites. It's just something that happens as they're leaving. In truth, they went out through the Novogrodic ghetto. They dug a tunnel and went out through a tunnel. We, of course, couldn't afford to do that on our budget, so it became a hole in the wall. But as they leave, you'll see one image here. As they've taken off their stars, and they just drop them onto the ground. And it dissolves into this beautiful silhouette shot. Alan Monroe actually came and shot a couple of days of exterior work for me, and so did Dan Lerner. Dan did extraordinary second unit work for me throughout the movie, in fact. Here again, you have the second movement of peoples going through the woods to this new place, and you see now that the camp has begun to grow. The Jamlankas are completed. They've put moss over them. They've begun to camouflage them.
What about you, Tate? I'm a watchmaker.
Can you repair guns?
Based on a true story about a watchmaker who became the gunsmith in the Otriad.
All right, please come forward. Everyone have your things out and ready. Yes, please.
Now you see Mark Feuerstein, suddenly his cap is different. Suddenly he seems more integrated into the group. He's working. He's able to sort of apply his intellectual skills to some of the leadership roles of gaining possessions.
Any bootmakers? Seamstresses?
I'm an accountant.
Oh, that should come in handy.
All right.
You have a new profession.
Mazel tov. Next.
I am a shoemaker.
Good. You're welcome.
Yes, please.
I am a nurse.
That's Kate Fahey, another actress from the National Theatre in England, coming now to play the nurse, Riva.
Friends, this is the happiest day of my life. To see you here, safely among
This may look easy, but the idea of giving a speech and going back and forth, keeping a horse in control, doing a speech like this is actually no mean feat. I know Mel Gibson did it in Braveheart, and very well, too. You have to act at the same time, though, and that's pretty hard.
Everyone will work. There are no exceptions. We will help supply our Russian partisan comrades. We will mend clothes.
And you see Alexa, she's wearing this very citified, very, very pretty, very almost refined costume with that little fur collar and that plush hat. And you watch her transform as the time goes on, too. These faces of the extras was very important. If we'd been shooting anyplace else, we just couldn't have had these faces. They're so distinctly Eastern European in their look. And I think that, too, lends a kind of additional weight to the whole experience for me.
In all of Belarusia where a Jew can be free.
And now James Newton Howard has introduced another theme, and this is really the theme of the hope of the community rising together. Peter Jan Brugge, who is my friend and producer who produced Glory for me long ago and so magnificently did this movie for so little, he said very early as we were watching the dailies, he said, it's important that the community be a character, and we feel the community as an additional character to our principles. And once we started to see that, it became a kind of watchword for us as I was shooting and trying to put the movie together.
It is the slingshot young David used to bring down the
This litany in the script is right out of almost the Book of Judges. As you read the Book of Judges and you read about the history of Jewish warriors, it's positively an Iliad. It's Judith and Deborah. It's Joshua and Samson and David and Jephthah and so many. And the idea that this is a tradition that was real in the culture and not suddenly discovered was important to us to try to articulate. shot.
Эта штука зарыта в землю.
This description of how to set a mine is something that I read in a Russian journalist's account of what the partisans did at the time. Of course, it becomes this nice little comic piece. It was important for us to try to set up some of these characters as being comedic because it was introduction and his naivete as to what he was getting himself into before he discovers the depth of their own anti-Semitism and their own danger.
Now this here, this is a knight and can move.
Now here's the chess set you saw Tuvьya carving. Now they're using it. Later you'll see them playing with it in the cold.
Tomorrow's special treat, potato soup.
Potatoes fulfilled a very important function. They were one of the few things that you could grow and store. You could make vodka out of it. You could make soup. It was, in fact, the staple that they lived on. And inevitably, they would make a still.
If you want to be a soldier, you drink.
What are you doing? What are you doing? What are you doing?
Soil, he's having a little drink.
Now, you see the character of Asoil. You see how, he was wearing that little cap before. Suddenly now, Jenny Bevan has given him, there's that sort of scarf around his neck. He's looking a little bit more grown up. His facial hair starting to grow in a little bit. And he's on that path toward manhood. And so he takes himself a wife.
Hello, Haya.
Hello, sorry.
Let me take.
Oh, no,
I'm not sure
fine.
I can.
No, I'm fine. Thank you. May I help you?
Hi, I was wondering if maybe you and I, if we...
I accept it.
You do?
Now, the wedding, as we begin to portray it here, it was a very important moment for all of us as we were making the movie because it's a very harsh setting to make this movie, and it was full of scenes that were very challenging. I think for all of us to do something that was celebratory and life-affirming, even as it fulfills the role in the script, it was important to us. And as we got into the shooting of it and began to really celebrate, I chose to introduce some real vodka into the proceedings, and I think it had a nice salutary effect. I think people really began to enjoy it as the party that it became, particularly as we wanted to juxtapose it to what was happening with the ambush. The idea, you can see how this scene is shot. One scene is with fake snow and the other is with real, and yet they sort of cut together. The idea that marriage and commitment would take place in the midst of the forest was very important to us. As it happened, Asoil died 6 months after the war ended, and he fathered a child with Chaya. The child never lived to meet her father, and that child, Asoila, came from Israel to watch us film this scene. And there she was, watching a scene about her father marry her mother, the father she'd never met, and it was very, very emotional for all of us. It was true of all the Belsky children who came to see the story of their parents, some of whom knew them and some of whom didn't. This juxtaposition of violence and celebration is key to the movie. It's what the movie is about, the idea that these things coexist and continue to exist. These musicians are real klezmer musicians from Belarus, whom Clay Froman, who's a guitarist himself and who worked with these guys and is actually playing there in the background. I don't know if you see him in a couple of shots. They developed this song themselves, and this was very likely the kind of music they would have listened to, if not the very thing. There was an old Belarusian folk song that they based this on.
Бельского родня, что ли?
Я сам Бельский.
At one point, when Daniel was dancing by me as we were filming, he leaned over and he whispered in my ear, "Career killer." It got very, very cold. The north of Lithuania is right by the Baltic. We were up near Finland, and there we were wearing our down and our Gore-Tex and having hand warmers and heaters at times. And all you could think about is what these real people had to deal with. How might they have done what they did through the worst winters imaginable? The winter of 1941 and 2 and 3 were the winters that stopped the Russians as they tried to go to Stalingrad and then had to retreat. And yet these people lived in holes in the ground. It was very moving.
Some talk of returning to the ghetto.
Eduardo's choice here in terms of the winter is quite extraordinary. It's traditional to go for a very blue feel. What he's done here is introduce green and even yellow, and it gives it a very distinct look, and it's a very successful choice, I think. Here's some of these faces again of the extras.
What time is it?
You have an engagement?
Is there any supper?
Not today.
We built these interiors at the exterior, so if the weather was bad, we could go and shoot an interior while it was terrible outside and not lose time in the schedule because we just couldn't stop shooting. So we built practical interiors with walls that would be removed that we can shoot. In the middle of the day, we could make them day or night and just keep shooting. And we built them on just outside of the set where the camp was. This was based on a story that I read about a man, not Zuсь Bельский, but just another partisan who had become very fond of his horse, who then realized that the horse had much more value as meat. And it was important to us to not describe these people as being overly sentimental, that they would push and shove, that they were hungry, and that they would, act in ways that were sometimes indecorous too. Now you see that Tuvья is wearing the coat. First you saw Zuсь take it, now Tuvьya is wearing it. This song is called Kupalinka, and Kupalinka is one of the very, very most famous Belarusian folk songs that a lot of the people there in Lithuania knew. And they taught it to us. This scene of Liev's is really extraordinary because he's doing the most subtle kind of acting in Russian. And as opposed to only learning it phonetically, he really decided to learn some of the grammar and really understood what he was saying. And it's really obvious as you watch him act in the scene.
А что ж мы делать-то умеем, а, Виктор? Помирать. Вот это у нас прекрасно получается.
This was a real barn. It was very, very cold.
Скажи лучше про брата.
This was one of the last days of shooting.
Тувья великий, спаситель иудейский, и вообще весь из себя большая шишка. Ты с ним соревнуешься. Это он со мной соревнуется.
Ravil is a really great actor. He was trained in Moscow at the Moscow Art Theater. He now lives in the United States and works in both places. His choice is a very brave one, I think, because he's a very accessible leader who is pragmatic, even compromised, and yet oddly sympathetic. Here you see we built one of the interiors right there on the set, so we make that transition from exterior to interior here.
Hello.
Hello.
Now, you haven't watched much of Alexa's transition. You've seen her working, but this is the first time that they actually have this this moment together. It was very subtle during the wedding as you see them eyeing each other, and this is the first real scene they have.
Today I go on my first food mission.
And I see in her performance this combination of wariness and yet determination. It's very compelling to me.
I must go.
Alexa's family comes from as much from Europe as from America, and she understood something intuitive about what the women were like here and the roles that they took on and the strength that they had. Now, of course, she has the coat.
Lilka.
Please take it.
Thank you, Tuvia.
And the antipathy to set up between the character of Arkady and Tuvia, which then later blossoms into real open revolt.
Property of the commander.
Tuvia, I'm beginning to see signs of some new sickness. 2 of the old ones have died this week.
Tuvia!
Miriam!
Now, believe it or not, that scene that you're looking at now is all fake snow. We shot that much earlier, and what's really amazing is that what Neil Corbold and his effects guys did to try to make that join work. You've seen real snow, so then when you see the fake, you don't, associate the difference. This here is, well, I'll let you guess. Is this real or is it fake?
Wait here for the others. Good luck.
The answer is that it's both. In some shots it's real, in some shots it's fake. But it's a very small portion of woods we were able to shoot in.
Who goes there?
One of the tricks that we used is using smoke with the snow. And in fact, what snow is not unlike, rain. It's a cloud that comes around you. So smoke feels very plausible as part of a snow scene. I don't know where the idea of the dog came from. We'd read little bits about dogs having been let go and run wild. It became a very good narrative means of showing her development. It's a very difficult scene to shoot, to get the dog to do what you want and to obviously have it safe with Alexa, and to actually do these stunts and have this dog there in proximity and, teach the dog to growl. They started working with this dog months before so that he would do these threatening gestures on command and still in the frame. One of the secrets we had was to have him start to work with that bag, and therefore it's something that he was able to focus on. That's a very difficult shot, the idea of having a dog jump on her. We did it in cuts, obviously. But the thing that makes the scene work actually is the next cut, when you see her actually pick the dog up because it's food.
I think it's typhus. If it is, we are in trouble. The lice are carriers. The partisans have ampicillin, but they say they need it for themselves.
What Clay and I decided here was the best part of the scene here, is that he asks if everything is all right, and she doesn't tell him, that no one really knows what happened. I think that's what ennobles her character at that moment. Now here's a different forest. We put the Russians in. It just feels different. And just to have that sense of place, it's much more dense, much more around them. I think they're firs and hemlocks rather than some of the other pines that were in the other forest.
Ба, какие люди! 2 Бельских сразу. Чем обязаны?
Eduardo also times it a little bit differently. It's much steelier, gray and blue, actually.
Медикаменты только для бойцов. Если у нас в лагере воспитанник тиф, он в этих вам перекинуться может.
Придется рискнуть.
Я категорически настаиваю,
товарищ командир.
Лучше не надо.
Подождите. Станкевичок в полицейском штабе, ведь должны быть медикаменты, правда?
Also, you see that Liev's character of Zусь is now starting to wear a costume much more like his allies there among the partisans. It's a quilted jacket, it's the Russian hat. And so he has departed even further from his brother and from the Otrяд. Now, this little village was part of that first village we used to an earlier effect when the truck was burning. In fact, we did it just around the corner on the same night as this shot.
Make sure it's in gear when we get back.
No, I'm coming with you.
I can deal with this tonight, Tuvья.
I had to make a choice here as to how to do this scene when they go into the police station. And we decided to shoot at 6 frames per second and triple print. And it was a decision that we were going to live or die by, because once you shoot at 6 frames, you can't suddenly make it into normal speed. I could have shot it at 24 frames and then used the computer to bring it down. I wasn't sure I had enough money to do that, and also I really didn't like the effect that it had. It didn't have that same smearing, that same sort of dreamlike quality that the scene takes on now. I just wanted there to be this notion that it's subjective, that it's Tuvья's experience of it as much as it is about the action of what's happening. Here again, a use of action more for the sake of the character, if you will, than for just the action movie part. These images, these were all done in camera. That's no visual effect afterwards. The kind of, we maybe used some 90-degree shutter, I think, but it's all done at 6 frames and triple printed. And once we finished, somebody said to me, was I sure it was ampicillin? And I thought I'd had that right, that I'd done the research, but it's possible that ampicillin came a few years later and it was only penicillin. I'm sure it's only one of the few, or one of the many inconsistencies in the movie for those who like to keep track of those kind of things.
Go! What about the others? Drive the fucking truck!
That's a shot that's real over their backs. And now this is poor man's process. This is Eduardo shooting on a stage, and it's really well done with the snow going by and the feel of light and movement. It's also the sound work, Lon Bender's work, and his sound design, really, the sound of that car and the sound of the various sounds of the forest, it really sort of ties it all together. This was a truck that we could barely get going once, let alone shoot a scene in it. So we were able to get that one shot over their backs, and that was it. And so we had to shoot this on the stage.
You're my brother.
So you remember?
Merciful God.
Now this poem that Alan Carduna reads, it's a bit of a poem. It's based on a very famous poem that I believe was written in about 1946 by a poet named Molodovsky. The idea of choose another people.
We have paid for each of your commandments. We have covered every stone and
it was, again, very, very moving to me because it was unsentimental.
Choose another people. Teach them the deeds and the prophecies. Grant us but one more blessing. Take back the gift of our holiness. Amen.
And you see everyone's costume now having become all about warmth. The scarves wrapped over the heads, the rags, the collars, all of it starts to, blend into being one sort of consistent look. It's also something that Jenny did with Eduardo, so that the palette of the movie are these grays and these blues and these colors that really just, amount to almost the look of a black and white photograph without being black and white at all.
Peter, who do you think you are?
I am in charge here. Get back in line.
So now the character of Soil steps up and begins to try to stand up for himself, and this is another step in his development and his growth, which is finally going to reveal itself in the third act of the movie. The great thing with an actor like Jamie is that this is the moment that he's in his life and in his career. He's no longer a child actor. He's about to become, a grown man. And the movie takes advantage of that because that's what's happening in the story as well.
What is happening here?
Those who risk their lives to bring back food.
This is another example of Daniel's willingness to really go against anything of the sort of movie star icon. He's sick, he looks bad, he's working with the makeup department to really darken his eyes, to make himself sallow, pale. He has no vanity when it comes to things like that, and it becomes so important in the production that he seems to go through something as they're all going through something, as opposed to standing out in front of everyone. The best thing that I've heard anyone ever say about his performance in this movie is that literally 3 minutes into it, you forget of, that there is a character named James Bond.
Tuvьya! Tuvьya, I would never...
I know.
So then why am I to be punished? On food missions, they take first for themselves and only bring back what's left over. And they spread the rumors that you are power-hungry and corrupt. That you take whatever woman you choose. That we keep the gold for ourselves and that you...
What? What else?
That you are no longer fit to lead us.
Maybe they're right.
Zusha would have punched him senseless.
Yes, I know.
Will I miss him?
He made his choice.
Laura, what happened? Who did this to you?
Gramov. To others. I used the officer's latrine. They said we won't shit in the same hole as a Jew.
Now, Ravil actually played the harmonium here, the concertina, and it's a song that he brought, and it's just great because, music was important to them, and so was drinking, and it just feels so real that they're entertaining themselves there. The idea of anti-Semitism among the Russians is a very little discussed subject within the Russian military, but it was a very, very interesting subject by which, Jews were first part of the Soviet system and then gradually, persecuted.
Антисемитизм – это нарушение партийной дисциплины.
But the scene has an interesting turn in it, which is he brings these charges, and his commanding officer realizes them and says, yeah, well, just move on. And it was a hard writing challenge to decide how a scene like this might actually play out. The guy makes an apology and yet manages to add an insult to it, and it makes it worse. And this is really about Zusha's disenchantment, his growing disenchantment and recognition of what he's gotten himself into.
Hey, Arkady! When will we eat? Where is our food?
Lazar, you will eat with the rest of the women in the Malbushim.
Tuvья. Mashka.
The village idiot.
I saw him trying to impress the girl.
Now, this scene we first scored, and James wrote a wonderful piece here, but we realized it started to make it a little too much like a Western gunfight. And there are even a couple shots in it that I didn't realize until afterwards, as one man steps over to one place and one steps over to the other, that it's starting to look like gunfight at the OK Corral. And we really wanted to take the curse off that, so we took all score out of it.
Arkady.
In truth, Tuvья Belsky killed at least one, possibly two men, one of them at the very end. It's not clear the circumstances why, but his leadership was often fierce and dictatorial. I think that's one of the more interesting aspects of this story, that these men were forced to do what they had to do in order to help the others to survive. And it wasn't always pretty, and it wasn't always appropriate. It's who they were.
What is this?
New policy. Fighters get better food.
The thing that works in this scene is the fact that he just shoots him. When we had the scene scored to music, it anticipated that, and you knew it was coming. And the key is to not know that it's coming. And that's why the scene works now. There's one little piece in here as he turns and Mark looks and he turns and now he looks and she looks and they look, and there's 7 cuts in here as Daniel turns and fires, and that's the essence of Steve Rosenblum's genius. Throughout the movie, his cutting is so austere and so subtle, and yet gives it this kind of intensity. The whole movie is cut with this kind of urgency, and yet not calling attention to itself ever. He's been my editor for 30 years. We went to film school together, and he's cut every movie that I've made. I think that in many ways he authors them as much as I do. And this music only comes in at the end.
Leave it for the wolves. Do it now.
And it's that violin again. But in a haunting way, not romantic, not sentimental. It looks like the 3 sisters out of a Chekhov play, the 3 women standing there. It was very amazing shooting these scenes actually there outside, because you weren't on a soundstage. It was very cold. So they had the additional element of feeling what these people must have felt. When you're trying to load a freezing weapon, or you're trying to dig a hole and your hands are numb, you actually don't have to talk much about Stanislavski.
Did you study nothing?
I was at university. What did you do before the war?
My wife, her father, he had the business, and before the rest was.
And she has passed. I'm sorry.
Alexa really manages to capture something of period here. There's a certain tentativeness, a certain awareness that she's beginning to go a little further than she may ever have gone, and yet wants to. Even the way she reaches behind his head to lay him down like that, it's very, very, very appropriate, I think, or tucks the covers around him.
My pleasure.
And now the coming of spring. And we had to wait for days for a moment when we could see the sun breaking through and race. We had to make fake icicles and fake water to go down there, wait for the sun to come through, because the sun was not very present. That shot, for instance, I saw the ray of sun. I said, Alexa, just step there, just step there. And this shot, too, I saw happening 3 days before and couldn't get it in time, and waited for a moment when I saw the sun breaking through at 5 o'clock exactly, and had the camera set up and said, Daniel, just walk over there, because I knew there would be a dissolve to be had here, of as if he's going into a place where things are beginning to change. And this photograph now, this group photograph, is an evocation of a real photograph that was taken of the Bielskis, of the Otrяд. And I just felt that was the real final coming together. And now, where we are down near a slightly different forest. This is something we shot again now in the beginning of the movie. We go back now to shoot the end in the beginning so that we could have leaves on the trees and they could be wearing, little clothing. And it will have seemed that we've gone from summer all the way through to spring. So it's a very hard thing to shoot the end of a movie first. You have to be very careful as to where you are emotionally, stylistically. You lock yourself into all sorts of things that you hope you don't want to change as you're making the movie, but that was our only hope at this kind of a schedule.
I'm pregnant.
And here you have Jodie May, one of the real great actresses of England, having come to work for weeks in the ensemble so as to give this moment everything that it deserves.
It could come any day. Who's the father? It happened when I was escaping. There was a man with a gun stopped me.
And typical of great money players, this was take one.
What will happen when Tuvья finds out?
He will understand.
No, you mustn't tell him.
I won't tell him.
I feel this new life inside me. It's the only thing keeping me going. And I won't give it up.
And this next scene that Alexa plays with Daniel is the scene that she came and she did in my office when she auditioned. And it was one of those moments when somebody walks in, I didn't know her work, I'd never met her. And I had met a lot of actresses for the part and tried to consider others who were of much greater celebrity. And Alexa just walked in and essentially took the part. She said, by virtue of her work, I know this. This is who I am. When that happens sometimes, and then you get to actually shoot the scene on the set, you're worried, is someone going to live up to that? Because now the cameras are rolling and the pressure is on, and of course she did wonderfully.
I cannot allow it.
You must let it live.
I cannot keep the living alive!
Here again, this is one of the first scenes we ended up shooting. It's just the luck of the draw. You have to go toward the end and the beginning, but that's why these are great professional actors, and they know how to go there because we've all talked about the arc of their performance and their characters, and
Not to become like animals.
this is where they're going to be.
Better way than by bringing a life into this world of suffering and death. It is our only hope. Thank you, Tuvья.
Movie kisses are hard. They have to each be unique, the same way that a fight has to, and their tentativeness in finding each other there is very important. Her emotion, his reluctance, it makes it its own scene. Now, the next scene coming up, I knew was going to be the real climactic scene of the second act. And the idea of them expressing as a group their latent violence and how that becomes manifest in the killing of the German guard was something that I really thought long and hard about. And again, with this extraordinary group of actors, all of whom were trained in theater, we basically worked this out as a little theater piece. Who would say what where, what the violence would look like, how that violence would grow, what the movements would be. Obviously, we had to work with a stuntman. We had to work with, with the stunt coordinators and stage it, and yet it really was something that was first worked out organically, improvisationally. I mean, obviously, I remembered the Shirley Jackson short story, The Lottery, or the Dürrenmatt play, The Visit. This became very important that it feel very, very real, and that the growth of it feels real. And the key to it was Eben, who you'll see finally says this thing about her son as she begins to really wail on him. And, here again, this is an actress who starred in movies, who's here, and suddenly in this one moment, you say, if not for her, how could the scene have really taken off as it did?
If you let him go, he will lead them back here.
Yes. All right. Ask if he'll promise not to reveal our location.
No.
Verspreche dich zu sagen, wo wir sind.
He will say anything.
Of course, what we expect is that Tuvья will step in and stop it. But that's not the point of the scene. The point of the scene is that he doesn't. Of course, we built a bunch of these tools to be out of rubber, and so nobody was going to get hurt, and the gun butts could be made of rubber. But nonetheless, it's a very dangerous thing when you're doing this, and here's Eben now.
He was only 15! My brother's name was...
You might notice that George McKay's face is terribly swollen there. He had gotten in a car accident on his way to this one of the first days of filming, and we had to figure out a way to justify why his face would be like that, so we added the line, the fact that he'd been, hit by a German soldier as they caught him. It's a little bit noticeable in an earlier scene. And this scene had been written to follow their lovemaking, but we suddenly realized that it had much greater effect when it followed that horrible moment of killing the guard, that they were now in relationship deeper, the time had passed, and they're talking about what happened and about their future, rather than it being a kind of a smoking the cigarette after lovemaking scene. Instead, it takes on a very different feel about their relationship.
You saved mine.
Now here was a great irony in that it had snowed so much at the end now, but the scene is supposed to be in spring. We had to bring out heaters, shovels, and all sorts of means of trying to get the snow off of the area outside this barn. The scene was supposed to be written outside, so instead we had to stage it in a barn and get rid of all the snow outside so as to now make it spring. This was one of the very last scenes we shot in the movie. And by shooting against a wall there, you couldn't see that all the trees beyond it were still covered with snow.
Мы все братья. Товарищ Бельский, это ваша местечковая чувствительность.
There was a wonderful Jewish-Russian journalist named Chaim Grossman who wrote several books, and Anthony Beevers, the great British historian who wrote the book on Stalingrad and the book on the fall of Berlin, uses his sources throughout. And I read several books that he wrote about the Russian partisans and about the Jews. In this moment, when you see the utter pragmatism of the Russians, in fact, logical pragmatism, that their job is to win the war and to sacrifice anything that gets in its way. And that was at the heart of this scene. Did I say Chaim Grossman? I think I mean Vasily Grossman. I think that was his name.
Спасибо за честь, товарищ.
Зусь, what are we doing?
Retreating.
What for?
I don't know.
As you look and he looks up there, you'll notice that those are pines, but the other things, the trees there are bare still. That gives away the fact that it's really winter, but I think we get away with it.
Children of Israel were afraid to leave Egypt until Moses.
And now this is the place in the movie where that metaphor of the Exodus becomes explicit.
He would take care of you.
And I was worried that it might be a little bit on the nose, but I felt it was important for those who might have missed the first bus to get this bus when it came by, to really understand that this was true. In fact, the idea of Passover came out of Nechama Tek's book, where in the end, in their third year, they had this extraordinary Passover Seder in which they celebrated their own Exodus. And that's where the metaphor of it first occurred to me.
The old, the sick, they'll never make it.
We leave now. Spread the word.
Shimon, this is it. We are going. Children, up, let's go. We are leaving back to your Zimlankas.
And now we get to a sequence which we had to shoot starting the very first and second day, which is the attack, because something of this complexity and difficulty really takes preparation, and you often have the most preparation in a film in the weeks before shooting, as opposed to having to prepare things as you're going along for the rest. So the attack of the two strafing planes here was something that we really had to really think through and have all sorts of meetings about. The idea of the suddenness of this, of bombs falling and their, that this haven suddenly being violated was, obviously something that was based on things that would happen just suddenly out of nowhere to these people. Neil Corbolt, the special effects coordinator in this movie, did Black Hawk Down and several other movies. He's one of the great British geniuses of this. And Daniel, of course, is so physical, and so is Jamie, and they were just in the middle of all of it. And we have children there and old people, so the idea of safety was obviously important. So you rehearse at underwater speed, at walking speed, at half speed, at full speed. You really go out of your way to try to keep people safe. Here Daniel takes this fall here on his shoulder, and he then, in the Bond movie that followed this, he hurt his shoulder several more times. And actually, when I just saw him a couple days ago, he had surgery finally to repair it. It was already hurt before either of these movies, but that shot there is a comp shot. That's a shot of stuntmen being pulled away on a pick, of an explosion, of an additional smoke layer, and then of the CG of the shell going in there. And you comp those shots all together to make that happen. The shot when the film all slows down is shot on a variable speed ramp. How it's regular speed, and you ramp suddenly on a variable speed motor to about, it must have been about 78 frames per second. And then you ramp back suddenly. I think the idea for that came out of a really terrific Russian movie that I recommend to anybody who's interested in the subject. It's called Come and See. It was made in the 80s in Russia, and it's about the Russian partisans, and it's a magnificent, magnificent movie. It's the only other movie I've ever seen that has anything to do with partisans, but it's really great. It's by a Russian director named Klimov. I believe a man named Klimov did it, and he died, and his wife took over and filmed it, actually. I think he was the head of Mosfilm. Now, of course, the character of Soil is beginning to take on his majority and take on his real authority. And here the people are forced to leave again. You get back to the image of the refugee having to leave, having to constantly be on the move. It was important for us that you rarely, if ever, see the Germans. You see an officer in the beginning once. You see a couple guys in that car that they shoot up. And even in this scene, they're out there. They're in the mist. Their gun flashes out of the mist. But it's not about them. It's about these people and their subjective experience. It would have been very easy to do those omniscient scenes where you hear the Germans saying, we're going to have to get them and we should put a price on their head, and you suddenly hear that dialogue. But the answer was, these people wouldn't know that, and I wanted we, the audience, to feel it as they would feel it. So they're out there somewhere. They're out there in the mist, in the trees. They're menacing, and their presence is there. But we just don't see them.
No, Moshe, quickly. Let me help you. Come. Careful, careful. Moving to the right.
Dan Lerner, in the second unit, shot some of this great stuff here, and really did a really wonderful job in some of these effect shots and some of the action things here. Because I really, at certain times, in order to make the schedule work, we had to be shooting two things at once, and he did a very great job here. This is one of the ideas, the woman with the machine gun who gets killed and keeps firing, that Clay and I had even while writing the script, and it's one of my favorite moments in the movie. It just it suggests some kind of extraordinary dedication, and then to see it, and then for Tuvья then to hear it and hear the machine gun stop becomes very significant, because now he knows that they're gone. I think that shot there is maybe one of the other poster shots that we used. And here we come to another truthful moment of the story. It's called the Krasnaya Gorka Swamp. Obviously, this shot here over his shoulder, that's a mat. But all the rest of the swamp stuff as they start to go through it is real. You'll see as we go over his back here in a moment, as they go in.
We have to keep going.
The Germans will be here any minute.
Are the others back yet? The soil?
This speech has a very interesting background, because initially in the first draft we wrote it for Daniel to say the idea that we will do this with our strength, that God will not part these waters. And somewhere after the first or second week of filming, I realized that it would be much better as something given to the character of a soil. And there are some actors who, if you come to them and say, I want to give this big speech away to, the supporting player, they would be upset thinking you're taking from them. But Daniel, of course, intuitively knew exactly what it meant, and he gave him an opportunity to go to a very different place, to a place where he's finally had enough, where he can't take any more, and allows for the character of a soil to rise up and for it to be really Jamie's finest moment in the movie. And it really becomes a thing that works best for both of them, but only because of his generosity, I think, in this moment and in so many in the movie, do you allow the other actors to really have their moments. So there are just certain actors who are too threatened to let that happen, but Daniel's, I think it's his confidence and his understanding of how to make the whole movie better, allows this to happen for so many of the supporting actors in the piece.
Soil! They're alive! Someone take them, take them! They're coming! They're coming! Why aren't we moving? Huh? We must keep going!
To there? It is impossible!
Nothing is impossible! What we all have done is
Steve
impossible!
Rosenbloom's cutting in the scene is really sublime.
Tuvья! The troops are coming. God will not part these...
Clemens Becker and Mike Proudfoot are the two operators on the movie, and their work throughout is quite amazing, because we often were, I would say always, ran two cameras, and sometimes I would be very concerned with one and leave the other one to really create as he might. And some of the work that they do, even without my seeing it until afterward, was just wonderful. Now this moment, Daniel stands up, is a moment that I knew, had to happen in the script. And he confronts his brother and he looks at him, and it says, after they look at each other, they embrace. But it was Daniel who suddenly grabs him and kisses him. And then you look, and it smudged his face with blood, because there had been blood on Daniel's face, and it's this great unexpected moment in the movie. almost like a kind of rite of passage. And now we go into the swamp, and this was nasty. There were endless conversations. We had to hire biologists and divers to find out what was safe. Were there any kind of bacteria that were dangerous? We had to get they're called dry suits for the actors, where they're totally covered under their costumes. And yet it was nasty. There they are, and we were in it for 2 days, and believe me, after the first day, they were not eager to go back there for day 2. But they were game. They did it. Even here, you see that the nature of the topography changes. Now you're suddenly in a swamp that has the trees growing out of it, just to suggest that the movement through time and space is really Herculean.
How much farther?
It's one of these subtle things. You've always seen Alan Corduner carrying his suitcase, his thing of books, and at this moment he's forced to leave them behind.
You can't sleep here. We can't time for sleeping now. Come on. Come on. My books.
It occurred to me long after that this moment here echoes something I did in a previous movie. There's a moment when Djimon Hounsou puts Leonardo DiCaprio on his back for a moment, and I was suddenly doing it again.
Soil, look, we've made it.
And here, for the very first time in that shot of Jamie Bell, you see the blue sky. It's the first time we're really letting sun come into the movie, and it's the idea that they've now made it. They've made it to the far shore, and you think they're safe. Of course, they're not entirely safe yet, and that's to be revealed, but it really is, suggesting that they're approaching the end of something, at least to me. Trevor Proud's work with the makeup is consistently good. I talked about Daniel and when he was sick and what he looked like, and look at the dirt on his face here now, and look how layers of it you had. First the battle, then the swamp, then the walking, and when you look at his face there, it's a kind of a roadmap of what they've been through.
Ridiculous.
It was kind of funny in the morning to see him, to say, all right, well, we're going to have to try to match and put you back in that state, and he'd be having him roll around and blowing dirt in his face and dust, and just to get him in that place where he had to, match with where they'd been the day before. And here again, when the tank comes, it's just one tank. In fact, that was all we could afford. It was one tank that had to be shipped from Berlin on a truck, and we had to bring it back because a couple of shots were, I think, hurt in the lab, and we had to reshoot a couple of things, and I just felt that would make the scale oddly scarier in some sense. It's one tank, it's 20 men, and suddenly it just feels more real. But the idea that this is a fulfillment of them fighting back, the idea that the women and the children are fighting there alongside the men, the idea that they have become this brigade that is defending themselves, it was the conclusion of something that they had been working toward. This is just, again, great cutting on Steve's part because we didn't have, the opportunity to do any of this in scale. So it's all done one small piece at a time. And then he really is putting that together artfully. Or you'll design one long dolly shot and that's all, and everything else is in pieces. It's actually the only moment where you see German soldiers in the movie, I think, really, with any number. And there's been a steady attrition through the movie. You've seen Shimon die, and now you're going to see the character of Malbin die. In what I think you anticipate to be a kind of heroic act and some great feat, but in fact it's futile. And that was deliberate on our part, that it seems just to be in the nature of things, that things don't always happen heroically, and yet it's his impulse that's heroic, and in some sense that evokes the spirit of what their resistance was in most other cases, whether that was the Warsaw Ghetto, or the Vilnius Uprising, or Lida, or any of the many places where there were other rebellions that didn't work. The idea was that it was the impulse to resist, that passivity is not powerlessness. It's about the strength of the victim to resist in whatever way he can, even if it's futile. That's where their dignity resided. Mark does the stunt himself, and it's hard. You've got to match a fall with an explosion going off and drop that grenade right there so it all works in camera. And then the pan to Daniel. Not easy to do. Liev, having done Hamlet and all the various Shakespeare heroes and the very, artful and sophisticated New York plays, is suddenly an action star. He was rather amused by this moment. Someone, upon seeing this movie, actually, and seeing this moment here, as Daniel walks forward and looks at Liev on the tank, asked me, now, did I do something to Daniel's eyes? Did I use CG on them to make them more blue? And I said, no, in fact, that is the color of Daniel's eyes. Tuvья Belsky's eyes were blue also, and he was fair-haired, and when you see their pictures together, it's kind of interesting that there's a nice resemblance. Same with the character of a Soil.
We must get out of the open. Showman!
Yes, Tuvья.
Everybody, tell them. Weapons only.
It's a very good young English actor named Ido Goldberg, who again came to be part of the ensemble. Done some shows of his own now in England.
Weapons only! Weapons only, everyone! Come on, let's move. Let's move, please. Hey! Let's move.
That little shot of Jamie watching them is a shot I couldn't get on the day. I had to pick that up at a different location much later. It's one of that little magic of movies that it cuts in. I wanted him to be part of this reunion and couldn't shoot it on the day. Ran out of time.
Where is the rest of your unit?
Good question.
Are you going back?
No. Perhaps you have room for one more.
I love that Liev plays about 6 different emotions in that beat before he says the line.
Let's go. Come on.
And this is a different wood altogether that we found for this last scene. And waited for one of the few sunny days we had. That's typical Liev with an idea, just to bang him as he goes past. It says all the things that a bit of dialogue couldn't.
The forest.
When I first began the process of preparing the movie and then directing it, I met with the sons of Tuvья and Züś, and we met in a hotel room in New York, and they were very wary of someone presuming to tell their story, their father's story. And one of the great pleasures that I had was to show the movie to them and to all their family, and also to many members of the partisans who were left alive. There aren't so many, there may be 15 or 20 now in the United States, and maybe the same number in Europe. But when one sets out to try to do a piece of history, what you really realize is you're taking on an enormous responsibility to those people who, as time goes on, will no longer be able to speak for themselves. It's the 11th hour for anyone who survived the Holocaust. The youngest living is probably in their 80s now, and within 5 or 10 years they will all be gone. And what I most hope is that in doing the best that we could, is that we honored their memory. My name is Edward Zwick, and I thank you for watching.